I never expected to find myself at 45, staring at my phone with trembling hands, reading a message that made my stomach twist into knots. The text from my younger sister Elaine glowed. Accusingly on the screen, annual family dinner this Saturday at Le Pont. Everyone will be there for Dad's 70th birthday. Don't come if you can't afford to chip in this time. We know things are still difficult for you since the divorce. 3 long years since Richard and I had separated, and my family still treated me like I was one wrong move away from destitution. In their eyes, I remained Richard's ex-wife who had thrown away security to chase a ridiculous dream of becoming a chef at 42. Never mind that I'd put my own culinary aspirations on hold for 20 years to support his medical career. Never mind that I'd managed our household, hosted his colleagues for dinner parties that advanced his reputation, and raised funds for the hospital charity while he climbed the ranks to become chief of cardiology. I set my phone down without responding and walked to my kitchen window. The street below buzzed with early evening energy, people rushing home from work or heading out to dinner. I'd chosen this downtown apartment specifically for its location, smaller than the suburban home I'd left behind, but perfectly positioned in the heart of the culinary district. My family had called it a downgrade. I called it strategic. The phone pinged again, another message from Elaine. Seriously, Melissa, don't embarrass yourself or Dad. Last time you couldn't even afford to order a proper entree. This is about family, not your ego. Heat rose to my face as I remembered the family dinner 6 months ago. I'd been in the final stages of securing my business loan, every penny carefully allocated. I'd ordered a small plate instead of an entree to keep within my budget, and Elaine had made a show of offering to help me out in front of everyone at the table. "You're too poor to attend a family dinner," she'd whispered when I declined her offer. "Maybe you should skip these until you're back on your feet." What she didn't understand was that I was being careful with money, not because I was broke, but because I was investing in my future. What none of them knew was that after the divorce, I hadn't just gone back to school, I had excelled. I'd graduated at the top of my culinary program, then worked 16-hour days under the notoriously demanding Chef Anton Devereaux, learning not just cooking, but every aspect of restaurant management. What they couldn't possibly know was that 2 months ago, I had opened my own restaurant, Le Jardin, to glowing reviews. And what would have left them speechless was the fact that 3 weeks ago, I had quietly purchased Le Pont, the very restaurant where they would be celebrating my father's birthday. The once prestigious establishment had been floundering under outdated management, and I'd seized the opportunity when it came on the market. I picked up my phone and typed a brief response. "I'll be there." Then I called my manager, Sophie. "The reservation for Morgan, party of 8 this Saturday, make sure they get the private dining room. And Sophie, I'll be handling that table personally." "You're sure?" she asked, knowing my family situation. "I'm sure," I replied. "It's time." As I hung up, memories washed over me. The day Richard had come home and announced he'd found someone who understood his ambitions. The stunned silence at the dinner table when I told my family I was going to culinary school. My father's concerned face. "At your age, Melissa? Be practical." My mother's gentle suggestion that perhaps I should find another doctor instead. And Elaine, always Elaine, with her cutting remarks about midlife crises and how I was throwing away everything I'd built. What they never understood was that I hadn't built that life. I'd merely maintained it while Richard built his career. Now it was my turn. I opened my laptop and reviewed the latest numbers from both restaurants. Le Jardin was already turning a profit in its 2nd month, unheard of in the restaurant industry. Le Pont was undergoing a subtle transformation under my ownership, its classic French cuisine being gently updated while maintaining the tradition its longtime customers expected. No splashy announcements, no press releases about the change in ownership, just quiet improvement. My phone rang, my sous chef from Le Jardin, Marco, calling about a supplier issue. As I helped him problem solve, I felt the familiar calm that came with knowing exactly what I was doing. This was my world now, and on Saturday, my family would finally see it. The journey to this moment had begun 3 years and 4 months ago, on a rainy Tuesday when I'd returned home early from a charity committee meeting to find Richard packing a suitcase. "I can't do this anymore," he'd said, not even startled by my unexpected arrival. "Vanessa understands me in a way you never have." Vanessa, his new research fellow, 15 years younger than me. Of course. What had surprised him was my response. I hadn't screamed or begged him to stay. Instead, I'd felt an odd sense of relief, washing over me as if a weight I hadn't fully acknowledged was finally being lifted. "How long?" I'd asked, my voice steady. 6 months, he'd admitted. "But it's not just about her. We've been going through the motions for years, Melissa. You know that." Perhaps I had known. The dinner parties that had once been collaborations had become obligations. The conversations that had once flowed easily had become practical exchanges about schedules and bills. Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped seeing each other. "Take the artwork," I'd said. "But I want the cooking equipment." He'd looked confused, then dismissive. "Fine, you can have your hobby tools." He hadn't understood that those hobby tools were the only things in our house that truly belonged to me. The French copper pots I'd collected one by one, the Japanese knives I'd saved for, the stand mixer I'd received from my grandmother. Everything else had been selected to reflect his success, not my passions. The divorce had been surprisingly straightforward. Richard, eager to begin his new life with Vanessa, had been generous in the settlement, more out of guilt and impatience than fairness, I suspected. I'd walked away with enough money to fund culinary school and have a small cushion left over for starting my business, provided I was frugal. My first day at the Institute of Culinary Excellence had been terrifying. Surrounded by students, mostly half my age, I doubted myself with every knife cut and temperature check. But Chef Louis, the fundamentals instructor, had noticed my determination. "You have the hands of someone who has been cooking with love for many years," he'd observed after watching me debone a chicken. "Now you must learn to cook with precision as well." Over the next year, I'd absorbed everything the Institute could teach me. While younger students complained about the long hours and demanding standards, I thrived on the structure and the clear metrics for success. For the first time in decades, I was being evaluated on my own merits, not as an extension of my husband. My family had been less than supportive. My father, a retired engineer who valued stability above all else, had questioned my impulsive decision. My mother had listened sympathetically, but suggested that perhaps a cooking hobby would be just as fulfilling as a career change. And Elaine, with her perfect life, successful husband, 2 children in private school, vacation home on the coast, had barely concealed her judgment. "You could at least get a sensible job in hospital administration," she'd suggested over coffee, shortly after I'd enrolled. "Richard would probably put in a word for you if you asked nicely." The idea of asking Richard for favors had made me laugh out loud, which had only confused Elaine further. She'd never understood that I wasn't trying to replace what I'd lost. I was building something entirely new. Graduating at the top of my class had opened doors. Several prestigious restaurants had offered me positions, but I'd chosen to work under Chef Anton Devereaux, not because his restaurant had 3 Michelin stars, but because he was known for mentoring chefs who went on to create successful establishments of their own. The 18 months in Devereaux's kitchen had nearly broken me. At 43, I was at least 15 years older than most of the kitchen staff, and Devereaux showed no favoritism. If anything, he pushed me harder. "You do not have the luxury of time," he'd told me bluntly during a particularly grueling service. "So you must work twice as hard and learn twice as fast." And I had. I'd mastered every station in his kitchen, from pastry to sauces. I'd worked 14-hour days, my hands covered in burns and cuts, my feet aching, my mind constantly absorbing techniques and timings and flavors. On my rare days off, I'd studied restaurant management and finance, developed business plans, and scouted potential locations. When I'd finally given notice to Chef Devereaux to open Le Jardin, he'd nodded once, then handed me a bottle of rare Bordeaux. "For your opening night," he'd said, "don't serve it to customers. Drink it yourself when the last table leaves. You will have earned it." Finding investors had been my next challenge. The first 3 banks had rejected my business plan despite its meticulous research and conservative projections. High-risk industry, they'd said. Limited experience, they'd noted. What they hadn't said, but I'd heard anyway. Too old to start over. It was a small local bank, led by a woman in her 60s, that had finally approved my loan. "My husband died when I was 42, the bank president had told me after signing the papers. Everyone expected me to sell his business. Instead, I went to business school and expanded it. I understand delayed dreams, Ms. Morgan." The months of renovation had been a blur of contractor negotiations, permit applications, and menu development. I'd been hands-on with every detail, from the garden-inspired decor of Le Jardin to the careful selection of local suppliers. My savings had dwindled as unexpected costs arose, forcing me to budget carefully in my personal life. Hence the small plate at the family dinner that had so amused Elaine. But then Le Jardin had opened, and from the first night, it had exceeded even my most optimistic projections. The blend of classic techniques and innovative flavor combinations had struck a chord with diners seeking something beyond the usual farm-to-table fare. A glowing review from the city's notoriously harsh food critic had filled our reservation book for months. And suddenly, I wasn't just staying afloat, I was thriving. When I'd heard through industry connections that Le Pont was struggling and might be for sale, I'd recognized the opportunity immediately. The venerable French restaurant had an excellent location and loyal clientele, but its menu and approach had grown stale. Most importantly, it was my family's go-to choice for celebrations, the place where they had gathered without me during. The year after my divorce, when I was finding myself in culinary school. The owner, Marcel Dupont, had been skeptical when I'd approached him. "You wish to buy Le Pont? But your own restaurant is very different. Le Jardin is modern, Le Pont is traditional." "Traditions evolve," I'd told him. "I don't want to reinvent Le Pont. I want to honor its history while ensuring its future." After reviewing my plans and the early success of Le Jardin, he'd agreed to sell, with one condition. "You will keep my chef, Pierre, for at least 6 months. He has been with Le Pont for 15 years. I'd agreed, knowing that Pierre's expertise would be valuable during the transition, even as I planned subtle updates to the menu. The staff had been informed of the ownership change, but I'd asked them to be discreet. No press release, no announcement on the website or social media. I'd wanted time to implement changes gradually before putting my name on the establishment. Now, as I prepared for Saturday's dinner, that discretion would serve another purpose. My family had no idea that the restaurant they'd chosen for their celebration was now mine. The week before, the dinner flew by in a whirlwind of preparations. I split my time between Le Jardin, where I was training a promising new line cook, and Le Pont, where I was gently guiding Pierre towards some menu refinements. "The duck confit needs a brightness to balance the richness," I suggested. "Perhaps a cherry gastrique with a hint of tarragon?" Pierre had been resistant to changes at first, but he'd gradually come to respect my culinary knowledge and business acumen. After testing my suggestion, he'd nodded appreciatively. "Madame Morgan has good instincts." Friday night, I stayed late at Le Pont, reviewing staffing and finalizing the menu for the next evening. I'd created a special tasting menu for my family that incorporated elements from our shared history, dishes my mother had made for Sunday dinners, reimagined through my professional training, wines from regions my father had admired, even a sophisticated version of the chocolate cake he'd always requested for his birthday. The head chef, Pierre, looked over my shoulder at the menu I'd created. "You sure about this?" he asked, noting the personal touches. "I'm sure," I replied, fingering the name badge I would wear tomorrow night. Not owner or executive chef, but simply Melissa. It would be enough. On my way out, I passed the private dining room and paused. The table was already set for tomorrow. Fine china, crystal glasses, silver that caught the dim light. I adjusted a fork that was slightly out of alignment and smiled to myself. Perfect. At home, I couldn't sleep. I scrolled through old family, photos on my tablet, holidays, birthdays, the gatherings that had grown increasingly tense after my divorce. In every recent photo, I was at the edge of the frame, slightly separate. The family outcast who had dared to start over at 42. My phone lit up with a text from my niece, Amanda, Elaine's daughter who had just started college. Mom's being weird about tomorrow. Says she had to remind you about dress code. You, okay? Amanda had always been different from her mother. More thoughtful, less concerned with appearances. Despite Elaine's attitude toward me, Amanda had stayed in touch, occasionally asking for cooking advice as she navigated her first apartment kitchen. I typed back, "I'm fine. Looking forward to seeing you tomorrow." She replied almost instantly, "Can I come see your restaurant soon? The pictures online look amazing." "But don't tell Mom I asked. She gets weird about it." I smiled. At least someone in the family had bothered to notice my achievement, even if she hadn't connected that achievement to tomorrow's dinner venue. Soon, I promised. Very soon. Saturday arrived with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I spent the morning at Le Jardin, ensuring everything was running smoothly before heading to Le Pont early to oversee final preparations. The staff had been briefed. They knew my family was coming, but I'd requested discretion. No one was to mention my ownership. Tonight, I would simply be their server. I reviewed the wine pairings one last time with Giselle, the sommelier who had stayed on after my acquisition. She'd been skeptical of me at first, but had warmed to my vision for the restaurant. The 2015 Barolo with the beef? Bold choice, she commented. My father appreciates Italian wines, I explained. This one balances tradition and surprise, like tonight's menu. Giselle smiled knowingly. The private party has no idea what they're in for, do they? I shook my head. Not a clue. At 6:30 p.m., Sophie texted me. They're here. I watched from an unobtrusive corner as the maitre d' led my family to the private dining room. My father, looking distinguished with his silver hair, walked arm in arm with my mother. My brother Michael and his wife followed, then Elaine with her husband Greg, and Amanda. My youngest brother David brought up the rear, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was slightly too tight. He'd never cared much for these formal family occasions. I waited until they were seated, then checked my appearance one last time. I wore a simple black dress, elegant but understated, appropriate for a high-end restaurant server. My name badge was pinned perfectly straight. I took a deep breath and walked to the private dining room. Good evening, I said as I entered. Welcome to Le Pont. My name is Melissa, and I'll be taking care of you this evening. The moment of recognition was not immediate. My father smiled politely. My mother nodded. Michael glanced up briefly from the wine list. It was Elaine who realized first, her eyes widening as they fixed on my face, then darting to my name badge, then back to my face. Melissa, she said, her voice strained. What are you doing? I smiled calmly. As I said, I'll be your server tonight. May I start you with some champagne to celebrate? We have an excellent Blanc de Blanc that I would recommend for the occasion. My father looked confused. Honey, you work here? Since when? Before I could answer, Elaine cut in. This is ridiculous. You don't need to wait tables at our dinner. How embarrassing. I maintained my professional demeanor. I assure you, it's no embarrassment. Now, about that champagne, I could see Amanda trying to suppress a smile. She, at least, seemed to be enjoying the moment. Yes, champagne would be. Lovely, my mother said, attempting to smooth over the awkwardness. I nodded and left to retrieve the bottle I'd had chilling. When I returned, the table was buzzing with whispered conversation that abruptly stopped as I entered. I poured the champagne with practiced precision, starting with my father as the guest of honor. "To Dad," Michael said, raising his glass. "Happy 70th. Everyone echoed the sentiment, though Elaine was clearly struggling to maintain her composure. "So," my father said after a moment, "is this your new position?" I could read the concern in his eyes, the worry that his eldest daughter had been reduced to waiting tables. "One of several responsibilities I have here," I replied ambiguously. "Tonight, I wanted to ensure your celebration was perfect." "But surely they could have given you the night off to join us," my mother suggested. "We'd be happy to have you sit down." "Later, perhaps," I said with a smile. "For now, I'd like to tell you about the special menu we've prepared for tonight." I proceeded to describe the tasting menu I'd created specifically for them. 7 courses that told the story of our family through food. A delicate amuse-bouche, inspired by my mother's spring garden. A soup that harkened back to the French onion my father had ordered on their first date. For each dish, I'd created a connection, though I presented it as if the chef had designed it based on information from their reservation. As I explained each course, I could see my father's expression shifting from concern to interest. He had always appreciated good food, even if he'd never understood my passion for creating it. Between courses, I moved efficiently, giving them space to converse while ensuring every detail was perfect. From my strategic position near the service station, I could hear fragments of their conversation. "I had no idea she was working here," my mother whispered. "Why wouldn't she tell us?" "Because she knew what we'd think," David replied, surprisingly. Perceptive, as always. Can you blame her? After the fish course, Elaine cornered me as I refreshed her water. "What is this about?" she hissed. "Some kind of revenge for what I said? Taking a job here just to embarrass us?" I looked at her calmly. "Nothing so petty, Elaine. I'm simply doing my job." "Your job," she repeated with a sneer. "Waiting tables at 45, and you wonder why we worry about you." I smiled. I never wondered that at all. As the dinner progressed, I could see my family's attitudes subtly shifting. The initial embarrassment was giving way to curiosity, particularly as they experienced the exceptional food and service. My father, especially, seemed impressed by my knowledge of wine and cuisine as I explained each pairing. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked after I described the provenance of the truffles in the risotto. "Culinary school was just the beginning," I replied. "Experience is the best teacher." When I returned with dessert, a sophisticated take, on the chocolate cake my father had always made for our birthdays, Sophie approached the table. "How is everything this evening?" she asked. "Exceptional," my father replied. Sophie smiled. "I'm so glad. Ms. Morgan has created something truly special." Here, a confused look crossed my father's face. "Ms. Morgan?" "Yes," Sophie continued, gesturing to me. "Your daughter has transformed Le Pont in such a short time. The critics are already taking notice." The table fell silent. All eyes turned to me. Set down the dessert plates and stood straight. "I purchased Le Pont 2 months ago," I said simply, "after opening Le Jardin across town earlier this year." The silence deepened. Amanda broke it with a delighted laugh. "I knew it! The plating! Style in the photos looked just like the dishes you used to post online. That's why you said I could visit soon when I asked." My father's eyes were wide. "You own this restaurant? And another one?" I nodded. "The divorce settlement gave me enough for culinary school. Chef Devereaux gave me an apprenticeship. The rest was hard work and a solid business plan. But you said..." "You couldn't afford," Elaine stammered, her face flushing. "I never said I couldn't afford anything," I corrected her gently. "You assumed. There's a difference between carefully managing investments and being too poor, as you put it." My mother reached for my hand. "Why didn't you tell us?" I looked at each of them before answering. "Because I needed to do this for myself, not for your approval, and because sometimes actions speak louder than explanations." I turned to Sophie. Would you mind taking over for me? I think I'd like to join my family for dessert. Sophie nodded and discreetly removed a chair from another table, placing it at the head of our table, a position I had never occupied in family gatherings. As I sat down, removing my server's apron, my father raised his glass again. "To Melissa," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for showing us all what it means to start over with grace." Everyone raised their glasses, even Elaine, though her hand trembled slightly. "It might be a bit expensive," I said with a small smile, echoing her words from months ago. "But tonight, dinner's on me." The rest of the evening unfolded with a new energy. My family, seeing me through fresh eyes, began asking questions about my journey. Real questions, not the dismissive inquiries of the past 3 years. "What made you choose French cuisine for Le Pont but a more contemporary approach for Le Jardin?" my father asked, genuinely interested. "They serve different purposes," I explained. "Le Jardin is my creative playground, where I can push boundaries. Le Pont has a history worth preserving, with room for thoughtful evolution." "And you manage both?" Michael asked, impressed. "That's a lot of work." "I have excellent teams at both restaurants," I said. "But yes, it's demanding, and rewarding in ways I never experienced before." Even Elaine's husband, Greg, who had always been politely distant, engaged with new respect. "The business model must be challenging. How do you handle the different market positions?" As we discussed the intricacies of restaurant finance and management, I could see my family reassessing me. No longer the failed ex-wife, but a successful entrepreneur. No longer the older sister making a foolish gamble, but a calculated risk-taker whose bet had paid off. After dessert, I gave them a tour of the kitchen, introducing them to Pierre and the staff. Pierre, who had initially been skeptical of working for a female owner, now beamed with pride as he showed off the modifications we'd made to the cooking line. "Madame Morgan understands both tradition and innovation," he told my father in his thick French accent. "It is rare to find this balance." As the evening wound down, my family prepared to leave. My father lingered behind. "I had no idea," he said quietly. "We've been so wrong about you these past few years." I smiled. "You saw what you expected to see." He nodded, acknowledging the truth in my words. "I'm proud of you, Melissa. Not because you've become successful, though that's impressive, but because you had the courage to begin again when most people would have just accepted their circumstances." His words touched me more deeply than I had anticipated. Despite everything, his approval still mattered. "Thank you," I said simply. As they left, Elaine approached me last. Her expression was complex. Embarrassment mingled with something that might have been admiration. "I don't understand why you let me believe you were struggling," she said. "Why not just tell us about all this?" I considered her question carefully. Would you have believed me if I had? Or would you have assumed it was wishful thinking or exaggeration? She didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. "Some things need to be seen to be believed, Elaine," I continued gently. "And some journeys need to be taken alone." She nodded slowly. "The restaurants are amazing. You're amazing. I didn't see it before." "Thank you," I said, accepting her awkward olive branch. "It means a lot to hear you say that." After they'd gone, I stood in the empty private dining room, reflecting on the evening. The reveal had been satisfying, but what surprised me was how little I needed their validation now. 3 years ago, their doubt had hurt me deeply. Tonight, their approval was pleasant but not essential. Somewhere along my journey, I'd found a sense of self-worth independent of their opinions. Sophie found me there, contemplating the empty glasses and the remnants of dessert. "Well," she asked, "was it everything you hoped it would be?" I smiled. It was exactly what it needed to be. Epilogue. A place at the table. 3 months later, my family gathered again, this time at Le Jardin, seated at the chef's table with a direct view of the kitchen where I worked alongside my team. No private room, no hiding. They watched as I directed the ballet of a busy dinner service, calling orders, inspecting plates, occasionally stepping out to greet regular customers. Le Jardin had continued to thrive, recently earning a coveted spot on the city's top 10 new restaurants list. Le Pont, under my guidance, had regained its former prestige while attracting a younger clientele drawn to our revised menu. I'd been featured in several industry publications as an example of successful career transition and female entrepreneurship in the male-dominated world of fine dining. My family's attitude had shifted dramatically since that revelatory birthday dinner. My father had become a regular at Le Pont, often bringing business associates and proudly introducing me when I was on site. My mother had tentatively asked if I might teach her some professional techniques, leading to a weekly cooking session that had brought us closer than we'd been in years. Michael and David had both become vocal advocates for my restaurants, sending friends and colleagues. Even their children, my nieces and nephews, now spoke of Aunt Melissa's restaurants with pride. Elaine had been quieter these past months, her barbed comments replaced with cautious questions about my business. Today, she arrived early, asking if she could see my office before the others arrived. I led her through the kitchen to the small space overlooking the dining room. She looked around at the awards already accumulating on my walls, the schedules and plans neatly organized on my desk. "I was wrong about you," she said finally. "I thought you were running away from stability when you left Richard. I didn't understand you were running towards something else." I studied my sister's face, seeing for the first time in years the girl who had once looked up to me before marriages and mortgages and social standing had become her measuring sticks for success. "We all have different paths, Elaine," I said. "Mine just took a detour." She nodded, then reached into her purse and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Amanda wants to work here part-time while she's in school. She asked me to give you her resume." She hesitated. I told her she should apply elsewhere, get experience on her own merits, not family connections. But she insisted you judge her fairly. I took the resume, noting the care with which it had been prepared. "She's right. I will." Elaine met my eyes. "I've never started over at anything. I'm not sure I'd know how." For the first time, I heard the vulnerability behind her judgment, the fear that had driven her need for stability and status. In her own way, she'd been as trapped as I had been, just in a cage of her own design. I thought about the years of study, the nights I'd fallen asleep over textbooks, the burns and cuts that marked my hands from kitchen work, the meetings with banks and investors who had initially been skeptical of a middle-aged woman with dreams of restaurant ownership. "You begin," I told her, "by remembering who you were before you started worrying about what others thought of you." Later, as I presented the final course to my family, I watched their faces, appreciative, proud, perhaps a little awed. The same people who had once pitied me now looked at me differently, not because I had proven my worth through success, but because I had finally shown them who I'd been all along. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the pain of betrayal, the uncertainty of starting over, the grueling work of building something new. It hadn't been an easy path, but it had been mine. And standing in my kitchen, watching my family enjoy the fruits of my labor, I wouldn't have changed a moment of it. As they left, my father lingered behind. "Your mother and I are celebrating our anniversary next month," he said. "I'd like to book the private room at Le Pont." I smiled. "I'll make sure you get the family discount." He shook his head. "No discounts. We pay full price." He squeezed my shoulder. "Some things are worth every penny." After they'd gone, I stood in my kitchen, listening to the familiar sounds of cleanup, feeling the pleasant exhaustion that came at the end of a successful service. Once, I had measured my life by what I had lost. Now, I measured it by what I had created. I untied my chef's coat and hung it carefully on its hook. The name embroidered above the pocket caught the light. Chef Morgan. No first name needed. I had finally become exactly who I was meant to be. Not someone's wife, not someone's daughter or sister, but wholly myself. And that, as it turned out, was enough. I thought about the night ahead. I had plans to review a potential new location, a small bistro that could become my third establishment. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. As I left through the dining room, I passed a young woman dining alone, studying the menu with intense concentration. Something in her reminded me of myself 3 years ago, the quiet determination, the careful observation. I stopped at her table. "Is this your first time dining with us?" She looked up, slightly startled. "Yes, I've been saving up for months. I just started culinary school." I smiled. "Then the tasting menu is on the house tonight. Consider it an investment in the future." Her eyes widened. "Are you—" "Chef Morgan," I said, extending my hand. "And I'm very pleased to meet you." Walking home later, I reflected on how life circled back on itself in unexpected ways. 3 years ago, I had been too intimidated to approach Chef Devereaux after dining at his restaurant. Now I was in a position to offer encouragement to someone at the beginning of her own journey. My phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. "Kitchen interview tomorrow at 2. I'm nervous, but ready." I smiled and typed back, "Just be yourself. That's always enough." As I entered my apartment, I caught sight of my reflection in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the shell-shocked divorcee of 3 years ago. This woman stood taller, her eyes clear and confident, her face relaxed but purposeful. I placed my keys in the small dish by the door, a handmade piece I'd bought from a local artisan to celebrate the opening of Le Jardin. Beside it lay the business card of an investor who had approached me after dinner, interested in discussing expansion opportunities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new possibilities. But tonight, I was content with how far I'd come. Not just the professional success, which was certainly gratifying, but the deeper understanding that had emerged from the journey, that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. Made myself a cup of tea and stood by my kitchen window, looking out at the lights of the city. Somewhere out there, a family was gathering around a table, sharing a meal at one of my restaurants. The food they were enjoying had been created by my hands or by chefs I had trained. The space they occupied had been designed according to my vision, from invisibility to influence, from dismissal to respect, from supporting player to leading role. "Welcome to my restaurant," I whispered to my reflection. "It might be a bit expensive, but it's worth every penny."